Back in 1999, I used to work as a park ranger over at Yosemite National Park. It wasn't a job I ever really saw myself doing. The fact was that, until my busted knees had to stop playing football, the NFL was all I ever dreamed of. I was obsessed. It was football in the morning, football in the afternoon, and at night, I used to dream of football. But, like many young men's dreams, they turned out to be nothing but the stuff of pipes. I needed a job, I needed money, and I needed it fast. So, when an uncle told me of an opening at the Yosemite for a park ranger, I jumped at the chance. He told me it was relatively easy work, mostly outdoors, and I could rely on it, as long as there was state funding. As long as there were still trees sprouting out of the ground, I'd always have work. So there I was, 23 years old, decked out in my park ranger's uniform, hiking through valleys and over hills, popping ibuprofen whenever my knees started to play up. I'd done the job for about 2 years in March of '99, and honestly, I'd grown to love it. Being out there meant being surrounded by nature on a daily basis. I mean, I'd see things weekly that wildlife photographers would give their left nuts to document. But I never in my wildest dreams thought I'd encounter the kind of thing I did on March 18th, 1999. It's something that I've thought about almost every single day since. Something I can't ever get out of my mind, and something I don't think I ever will. It started off a chain of events that I gradually became obsessed with and that have changed my life forever. It started with a call about a potential forest fire-up. My boss called and told me a hiker had seen some smoke rising up through the trees near a place called Log Cabin in Sonora County. I probably don't need to tell you that forest fires can be absolutely devastating to an area like Yosemite and are taken very, very seriously by us park rangers. Now, y'all should know that Log Cabin isn't technically in our jurisdiction. It's actually closer to a different national forest. But, since there was no one up there in that area to go check it out, my boss asked me to go check it out and call in the fire department if it was a serious threat. We get a good number of calls like this, and more often than not, it's just a family whose barbecue has gotten out of hand, or kids whose campfire is a little too big. So, I agreed to drive up there to check it out, as it was only a couple of hours drive there and back. So, after about an hour's drive, I arrive up at Long Barn, and I could see some black smoke rising up through the trees in the distance. This is unusual, as black smoke means it's not just wood burning, more like plastic or artificial fabrics, so it definitely wasn't wood burning. This is kind of a relief at first. It meant it wasn't an outright forest fire, but it did mean somebody was burning something that definitely was not good for the environment. I park up as close as I can to the source of the smoke, then hike off through the trees, basically just following my nose as the smell of the burning plastics got stronger and stronger. Then I see it, a burned out car abandoned among the trees, still kind of smoldering. But I guess the fire had been set at night and had mostly burned through before I got the call about it. My first thought was joyriders. Something as simple as car thieves had bust into somebody's vehicle, tore it up, and down the quiet country roads up here, just abandon it and set it alight to cover up any evidence. Again, this is a pretty unusual crime out here in the sticks, and you can forgive me for associating that sort of wanton mischief with more urban areas. But then I started to smell something else among the smoke. Something more like burning meat. Listen, I'm a huge barbecue guy myself, and I know what it smells like when you leave something on the grill for too long. Like that charred stench that I know is going to lead to disappointment because I've messed up on some expensive T-bone steak, or whatever. Only, you're definitely not supposed to smell that coming off a burning car, are you? And as soon as you can imagine, I started to feel very, very uneasy about the whole thing. I circled the burning vehicle, looking for signs of animal carcasses or, God forbid, human bodies that were in or around the vehicle, but saw nothing. I even checked under the car, but again, didn't see a thing. I pull up my phone to get in touch with the county sheriff, who said he'd send over a couple of guys to check the scene out within the next hour or so, but who also asked me to stick around so I could guide them in and show them exactly where the vehicle was. So, given the fact I had an hour or two to kill waiting for them, I went into the trunk of my truck, pulled out the little fire extinguisher stored back there, and proceeded to put out a few small fires still burning in and around the vehicle. I do so pretty effectively, but when I'm done, I notice there's still something smoldering in the trunk. Smoke keeps seeping out of the cracks, and the more it does, the more I can smell the burning meat smell. That's when it really hit me. Something or someone was in the trunk. That's where the smell was coming from. Waiting for those sheriff's deputies seemed like it took an eternity, mainly because when they got there, I knew they'd be able to open that trunk, and I really didn't want to see what was inside. So they get there, I tell them what I suspect has happened, and what I suspect is in that trunk. One of the guys uses a crowbar to wrench the trunk open, which was pretty easy considering the fire had warped the metal locks, keeping it closed. But what we saw inside is something I saw over and over again in my nightmares for many nights to come. It was a mess of blackened, burned flesh and contorted limbs. The sight of it alone caused me to gag and retch, puking up my breakfast onto the forest floor. Even those deputies, hardened by years of witnessing violence and cruelty on a daily basis, had a hard time dealing with what they were seeing. One just leaned against a tree, mouth covered with a cloth rag he kept on him, probably for this exact reason, while the other called in the coroner to deal with the bodies. They told me I can make a move back to Yosemite whenever I was ready, and boy, was I ready to get out of there as soon as I was able to. From what I understand, the sheriff's deputies soon discovered that the two scorched bodies in the trunk of that burned out vehicle were those of Carol Sund and Sylvina Palesso. The two women, along with Carol's young daughter Julie, had been missing since the previous February when they were last sighted alive and well at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite National Park. It was actually one of my colleagues over at the park that had been the last person to see them alive, and the whole thing had drawn national attention, landing them on the cover of People magazine when some journalists took an interest in the story. And I mean, it was a really interesting story, even though it was very morbid. Carol's wallet had been found on a street in downtown Modesto, California, 3 days after they had disappeared, and Julie Sund's body was found dumped in a heavy underbrush by an overlook at the Don Pedro Reservoir, several miles from the logging trail where the car had been found. Her throat had been slit from ear to ear. Local sheriffs and the FBI initially focused their investigation on a group of meth heads up in northern Cali who had previous convictions for stalking and assaulting lone groups of women. But all those leads were abandoned when a break in the case cast light on another suspect. Because the story doesn't end here. In fact, it got even worse for all of us that worked up there. One of the staff members at the Yosemite institution was a young woman named Joey Ruth Armstrong. Joey was friendly, bubbly, and generally just a joy to be around. I'd only ever met her once or twice in my time as a ranger, but I could see why she was a popular member of the team. She loved nature, and she loved her job, even more passionately than most others on our staff. But in July of the same year, 1999, Joey had made plans to spend a weekend visiting friends down in Sausalito. Team members who lived in the log cabin she shared with them in Yosemite Village said their goodbyes, wished her safe travels, and watched as she wandered off among the trees to catch a ride down to Sausalito. But a few days later, when she was due to return to the village, she didn't show up. She'd actually left some contact details with the team, just in case they needed to talk to her, but when they followed up with a call to check up on her, Her friends told them she hadn't actually arrived to spend the weekend with them, and that they were starting to get worried. A group of rangers went over to the cabin that she stayed at, only to find her white pickup truck was still parked in the driveway, packed with luggage for her trip. Having decided to begin their search in the immediate area, the rangers split up into smaller groups. They trudged through dense brush, watching for rattlesnakes and looking for signs of their missing coworker. Then, after only a short while of searching, they apparently spotted footprints, broken saplings, trampled ferns and grass, all signs that someone had recently ran, or perhaps even been chased. That's when one of the rangers noticed something metallic, glinting in the sunlight just a few feet away. It was a keyring, lying in a shallow ditch. It was the sighting of this keyring that led to them spot something else. It was a dead body. It had on the white t-shirt and blue jeans that Joey had been wearing the day she left. Except now, they were filthy, dirty, encrusted, and bloodstained. But despite bearing such similarities to our missing coworkers, it was impossible to immediately identify the body. That was because whoever had killed this person had also taken the time to cut off the head, decapitating it completely. For those of us that worked in and around Yosemite, Joey's murder meant that the nightmare of those burned bodies, the nightmare we'd all tried to forget about, had come back with a vengeance. The killings were made even more disturbing to us by just how rare it was for anything like that to happen in this area of California. According to one of the older rangers, the last known murder to occur inside Yosemite's boundaries happened 12 years earlier, in 1987, when a guy pushed his wife off a cliff in order to collect on a life insurance policy. As you can tell, I've thought about this whole thing and researched the various murders a whole lot, and I've discovered that the chances of being murdered in one of our nation's national parks is about 1 in 20 million. Basically, you have more chance of drowning in your own bathtub. So please, don't think this is an actual thing. People don't just hang around in the woods waiting to ambush unwary hikers. In the months that had followed the discovery of those burned bodies in the trunk of the car, the cops had almost no luck in finding a suspect. And honestly, we didn't expect Joey's murder to be any different. But, unbelievably, in the immediate aftermath of her killing, local authorities got lucky thanks to a witness statement given by one of our coworkers. They had noticed a blue and white 1979 International Scout parked near Joey's cabin on the night of her death, and the cops put out an APB right away. Then, a few days later, 2 park rangers spotted a vehicle that looked remarkably similar, parked on the shoulder of a highway not too far away. What happened next was truly bizarre. I spoke to the guys who found the truck, who said they searched around it for a while until they came across a guy sunbathing, completely naked, at a nearby riverbank. They asked who he was, and he told them that he was a handyman at the Cedar Lodge, some vacation homes built close by, and that his name was Cary Stainer. The guy seemed kind of embarrassed that he'd been caught in the nude like that, and quickly left the area. But my coworkers immediately called the encounter into the local cops, who showed up and compared the tire tracks left by the truck to those left at the scene of Joey's murder. They came back as exactly identical. A few days later, the same weird guy was taken into custody while he was visiting some nudist resort over near Sacramento. When they took him into custody and interviewed him regarding Joey's murder, he confessed. Just straight up confessed. Then, also confessed to the fact that he'd murdered Carol, Sylvina, as well as Carol's daughter, Julie. The FBI were called in for additional questioning, and it was then that Cary Stainer told them all about how he had fantasized about hurting women ever since he was a child, and how he had been completely unable to silence the voices in his head that told him to kill them. For 5 whole months, this absolute psychopath had been living right under our noses, hiding in plain sight. He'd been chilling up at the Cedar Lodge, doing his job, eyeing up potential victims under the pretense of being a friendly, little kooky local handyman. From what I can gather, No one had suspected him of anything to do with the disappearance of Sund Palesso because he had just seemed way too nice. Too much of a regular dude. That and the Steiner family name had been in the news before, for a reason that led investigators to believe there was no way that he had it in him to do something so terrible. You see, many years before, when Carrie was just 11 years old, his younger brother, 7-year-old Stephen, disappeared without a trace one afternoon while walking home from school on his own. This devastated the family, causing a huge rift between Carrie and his dad. Eventually, Stephen escaped captivity after 7 long years as the sex slave of Kenneth Parnell, a convicted pedophile and former employee of the Yosemite Lodge inside the national park. He became a celebrity of sorts. There was national newspaper and television coverage, as well as a book and a TV miniseries chronicling his years of abuse. Whether or not that whole thing shaped Carrie into the violent psychopath he eventually became is something I don't think anyone will be able to properly determine. But shortly after, Carrie began to claim he'd seen Bigfoot. Yes, the 8-man thing that's said to inhabit the woods of the Pacific Northwest. He was well on his way to being completely detached from reality. At his trial in 2002, Steiner pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyers asserted that the entire Steiner family had a history of sexual abuse and mental illness, manifesting itself not only in the murders, but also his obsessive-compulsive disorder, his obsession with cryptids, specifically Bigfoot, and his request to be provided with obscene images in return for his eventual confession. He was nevertheless found sane and convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder by a jury on August 27, 2002. The court then had to decide if he would be executed for his crimes, which it unanimously decided that he should, and rightly so. Steiner remains on death row as of September 2019, but problems with California death penalty laws are frustrating the process, and it's becoming increasingly unlikely that he will ever suffer the same fate as many of his victims. I know this was an overly long post, but as I'm sure you can all understand, this is something I've been quite frankly obsessed about, since the discovery of those burned bodies affected me too personally. I'm actually considered writing a book about the whole thing, and my experiences living and working in the place that most of these crimes had occurred. If I can't ever get these things out of my head, why not try and turn the whole thing into kind of a therapy? Turn it into something that others can enjoy, and maybe something I can make a few bucks out of. Even if that does make me feel like a vampire, profiting off of other people's misery. Maybe. Let me know. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe, just maybe, it'll help you stay safe in a world where people are out there with word compulsions unimaginable, driving them to kill. Growing up, I was always on the heavy side. I suppose it's become I come from a family of food lovers whose portion control was never their strongest suit. It was all TV dinners and sedentary hobbies, so it's no wonder we were all of a certain size and shape. But it's always bothered me. I'd see the attention skinnier girls got around school, and I know it doesn't align with mostly feminist view of the world. I wanted that to be me too. So, a few years back, I started my own personal weight loss journey. Not so much so that I could fit society's view of what beautiful is, but so that I could have confidence in myself and in my body. I wanted to look good for me, and if that helped me land a hot guy, then cool. This is how I ended up taking up hiking as a hobby, and why I spent so much time around Acadia National Park up here in Maine. The views up there also allowed me to indulge another hobby of mine, photography. And sure, my pictures don't make it any further than my Instagram account, but still, it's something that brings me a whole lot of joy. Sometimes I drive up there with friends, but they couldn't commit to those long trips all the time. So there were times when I'd have to go up to Acadia alone in order to get my few hours of exercise in. So I'm hiking the trails up there, taking pictures of the way, with the sun glinted off the ocean through the trees, messing around with filters, you know, the usual photography stuff. I thought I'd managed to get this one amazing shot, something that was bound to get a whole bunch of attention on Instagram, when I hear a voice sounding from behind me. Lovely day for it, huh? It was a man's voice. Friendly sounding, but still, the shock of hearing it so suddenly made me jump. I turned, seeing a man in a park ranger uniform, the hat, the little shorts, the whole getup, walking up the trail behind me with those sort of trekking poles in his hand. Yeah, gotta make the most of the nice weather here in Maine. It's super rare. I tried to sound as cheerful as possible, but I won't lie. I didn't really want the attention, at least not from an older guy like that, who'd also managed to ruin the composition of the photograph I was in the process of taking. I know that makes me sound unfriendly or whatever, but honestly, sometimes us girls just prefer to be left alone. But he continued to make conversation in that super annoying way that some people do. It's like they can detect that you just want to have some time to yourself and opt for being gregarious. So I remained polite for as long as I could, nodding along as he talked about how lonely it could be being a park ranger up here. Then eventually, just straight up asked him politely to leave me to my photography, making something up about being a professional photographer who was surveying the area for a magazine I worked for. I know, I shouldn't have lied, but I got the distinct impression he wasn't going to leave me alone otherwise. But he took it on the chin. I suppose he got the craving for human contact out of his system. He told me he was so sorry to interrupt, wished me luck with my work, then carried on down the trail. So I take my photos, taking my time over them, but he decides to turn back and walk the opposite way, so I don't run into him again. I didn't think he was creepy or anything. I just didn't want to have that awkward moment of running into the guy again and being like, oh, hi. Call me neurotic for wanting to avoid that, but that's just the way I felt about it. So I'm heading back the opposite way, taking pictures along the way, capturing the way the trail snaked through the trees in such pretty ways sometimes, looking like something out of a fairy tale. I happen to take a particularly aesthetically pleasing one, and I'm admiring it on my phone, when I happen to notice some small detail in the center right of the frame. It was a figure, clearly wearing a pair of shorts, peeking out from among the trees. I know that's a pretty innocuous little detail. I know it was just the ranger I'd seen like an hour previous, but it sent a chill through me. Just how had he managed to loop around and get ahead of me, even though he walked off in the opposite direction to what I had? I felt distinctly unsafe, a flash of fear running through me as I began to suspect that this ranger guy's intentions were far from good. I mean, who just follows somebody like that? Or rather, it wasn't even following me that he was doing. This guy was straight up stalking me, but I had no choice but to walk by him. He had literally put himself between me and my car, so I had to just suck it up and walk past him, even if it was putting on a brave face to do so. I tried to cut him off, if that makes sense. I was prepping myself to just be like, hi there, can't stop, late back for a meeting, or something to that effect. But it was him that spoke first. You know, it's just safe for a girl like you to be walking around the park alone. I can't remember exactly what he said, that's just my estimation of it. You're really pretty, and bad things can happen to a pretty girl that walks around on her lonesome. I was ruined. I tried to think of something witty to say, some cutting retort that would shame him for being way, way too familiar. But I couldn't. I was just terrified. Who says that to a total stranger? So I just carried on walking at an increased speed, ready to call 911 if he started to follow me. But he didn't. He just shouted where you going? Don't you want some company? Take care. Being rude like that, little lady. You might just end up being rude to the wrong person. I thought, crap like that only happened in horror movies or something. That creeps like that couldn't really be walking among us, or that if they were, I suppose I just hoped I'd never encounter one. So I get to the end of the trail, back to the parking lot where I'd left my car, when I see another ranger milling around the area, taking little markers out of his trick or whatever. I walk up to him and demand to know who the other ranger on duty was, describing the way the guy looked, how his uniform was all dirty and stuff, how he carried that trekking pole, when suddenly, I just started to feel sick. This other ranger, his uniform looked almost nothing like the guy back in the woods. It was clean, pressed, and starched. A lighter khaki color with different styles of patches on it. Same kind of Maine Park Service kind of thing, just different looking. I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. There was no other park ranger on duty at the time. He was the only guy in the area, and no one else should have been wearing a ranger's uniform. He saw the look of horror on my face, that nauseous, shell-shocked look, as I realized just how much danger I'd been in walking around with that guy on the loose. I told him everything, but I didn't stick around to see what came of it. I just got in my car and down back north towards Ellsworth, and it took me a long, long time before I was able to go back to Acadia, even with friends. And I make a point to just never, ever go to secluded places like that alone now. It's just not worth the risk of running into someone like that. Someone willing to dress up in order to trick young women into feeling safe, when in reality, they may well have very, very different intentions